My name is Margaret, and I'm 67 years old. I used to think the worst pain was burying my husband, watching the earth swallow the man who held my hand for 42 years. But I was wrong. The worst pain came the day my own son, Michael, stood in my kitchen where I'd baked his birthday cakes and bandaged his scraped knees and told me to leave. "This house isn't yours anymore, Mom," he said, his voice sharp like he was scolding a child. "It's time you moved on. We need the space." His wife Karen stood behind him, her arms crossed her lips, pressed tight, as if my presence was an inconvenience she'd tolerated too long. The air in that room felt heavy like the moment before a storm breaks, and I stood there, my hands trembling, clutching the edge of the counter I'd scrubbed clean for decades. I looked at Michael, searching for the boy who used to cling to my skirt, the one who'd cry when I left for the grocery store because he didn't want me out of his sight. But that boy was gone. In his place was a man in his 40s, his eyes cold, his jaw set as if I were a tenant overstaying my welcome. "Michael," I said, my voice softer than I meant it to be. "This is my home. Your father and I built this place. Every nail, every brick, it's ours." He didn't flinch. He just sighed like I was being difficult and said, "Things change, Mom. You can't hold on to the past forever." Karen stepped forward, then her voice clipped. "We're starting a family, Margaret. The kids need their own rooms. You don't need all this space just for you. Just for you." Those words cut deeper than anything else. They made me feel small, like I was a guest in my own life. A relic taking up space that belonged to someone younger, someone more important. I wanted to scream to remind them that I'd raised Michael in this house, that I'd nursed my husband through cancer in the bedroom upstairs, that every corner of this place held pieces of me. But I didn't. I just stood there, my heart pounding my throat tight, and nodded. Because that's what I'd always done, nodded, smiled, and carried on, no matter how much it hurt. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the one we'd painted yellow because my husband Tom said it felt like sunshine. The photo albums were stacked on the coffee table, the ones I'd spent years filling with pictures of Michael's first steps, our family vacations, Tom's proud grin at Michael's graduation. I opened one, my fingers brushing over a photo from last Christmas. There we were. Michael, Karen, their 2 kids, and me standing off to the side, my smile forced. Karen had posted that picture online, cropping me out. The family, she'd captioned it. The family. As if I didn't belong. As if I'd never belonged. I closed the album and stared at the walls, at the framed pictures where I was always on the edge, half hidden like an afterthought. They didn't want me in their photos, their memories, their lives. And that's when I realized something that broke my heart. All over again, I'd spent my life building a family that didn't see me. I'd poured every ounce of myself into them, my time, my love, my dreams, and now at 67, I was being asked to disappear, to make room for their future, as if I had no place in it. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase, just a few clothes, my wedding ring, and the locket Tom gave me when Michael was born. I didn't tell Michael or Karen I was leaving. I didn't leave a note. I just walked out the front door, the one Tom had carved our initials into when we moved in, and drove away. The house grew smaller in my rearview mirror, and with every mile I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the life I was leaving behind, and relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to smile through the dismissals, the eye rolls, the way Karen would talk over me or Michael would forget to call. I was done being invisible. I ended up at a small motel an hour away, the kind with flickering neon signs and creaky beds. The room smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, but it was quiet, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands, the hands that had rocked my son to sleep, that had held my husband's as he took his last breath. They were wrinkled, now spotted with age, but they were still strong. And I thought to myself, "Margaret, you're not done yet. You're not some old woman to be shoved aside. You're still here. You're still you." That night, I cried. Not the quiet tears I'd shed in secret over the years, but big heaving sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for the girl I'd been the one who dreamed of a big, happy family. I cried for the woman who'd lost her husband and thought her children would be her comfort. I cried for the years I'd spent trying to be enough, only to be told I was too much, too old, too needy, too in the way. But when the tears stopped, something else took their place. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity. I didn't have to beg for a place in their lives. I didn't have to shrink myself to fit their story. I could write my own. The next day, I drove to the cemetery where Tom was buried. I sat by his headstone, the grass cool under my knees, and talked to him like I used to. "Tom," I said, "I don't know what to do. They don't want me. Our boy, he doesn't want me." The wind rustled the trees, and I swear I could hear his voice steady as ever telling me to keep going. I touched the locket around my neck, the one with his picture inside, and made a promise. Not to Tom, but to myself. I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to let them erase me. I'd spent too many years building a life to let it crumble because they couldn't see my worth. I didn't know where to start, but I knew I couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to that life. So I drove to the next town over a place where no one knew me and rented a tiny apartment above a bookstore. It had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a window that looked out on a quiet street. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since Tom died. Hope. Not the loud, shiny kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that grows in the dark like a seed pushing through soil. I unpacked my suitcase, hung my clothes in the closet, and placed the locket on the nightstand. Then I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notebook I'd bought at the corner store. I started writing. Not a letter to Michael or Karen, not a plea for them to see me. I wrote about me. My memories, my dreams, the things I'd wanted before I became a wife, a mother, a widow. I wrote about the time I wanted to be a painter, how I'd sketch flowers in the margins of my school books. I wrote about the summer Tom and I danced under the stars before life got heavy. I wrote until my hand cramped, and when I stopped, I felt lighter, like I'd reclaimed a piece of myself they couldn't touch. The days turned into weeks, and I settled into my new life. I got a part-time job at the bookstore downstairs, shelving novels and chatting with customers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it made me feel useful. The owner, a kind woman named Ruth, became a friend. She was in her 70s with a laugh that filled the room and a sharpness that reminded me of Tom. One day over coffee, I told her about Michael, about the house, about the photo albums. She listened, her eyes soft but steady, and when I finished, she said, "Margaret, you don't need their permission to matter. You never did." Her words stayed with me like a song I couldn't forget. I started painting again, small canvases at first, flowers and landscapes I'd see on my walks. I hung them in my apartment, and Ruth insisted on displaying one in the bookstore. "You've got talent," she said, and I blushed, feeling like a girl again. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I kept painting, and with every brushstroke I felt stronger, like I was building something no one could take away. I didn't hear from Michael or Karen. Not a call, not a text. I'd left my number with a neighbor in case they asked, but they never did. At first it hurt, a deep, aching hurt that woke me up at night. But as the weeks passed, the pain changed. It didn't go away, but it grew quieter, like a bruise fading. I started to see my life differently. I wasn't just Michael's mother or Tom's widow. I was Margaret, and I had stories, dreams, a life that was mine. One day, while shelving books, I found an old journal tucked behind a stack of romances. It was leather-bound, the pages yellowed, and inside were poems written in a looping script. They were about love loss and starting over, and they hit me like a wave. I bought the journal and took it home, reading it cover to cover. The last page had a single line, "You are enough." I cried again that night, but not from sadness. I cried because I was starting to believe it. I kept writing in my own notebook, filling it with more than memories now. I wrote about the future, about the things I wanted to do, the places I wanted to see. I wrote about the woman I was becoming, the one who didn't need a family photo to prove her worth. And slowly, without me even realizing it, I was changing. I stood taller. I laughed more. I looked in the mirror and saw someone I recognized, someone I liked. But the past wasn't done with me yet. One afternoon, as I was arranging a display in the bookstore, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered, my heart skipping a beat. "Margaret," a voice said, and I froze. It was Michael. He sounded different, not cold like before, but hesitant, almost nervous. "We need to talk," he said. "It's about the house." I felt a chill, like the ground was shifting under me. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew one thing: I wasn't the same woman who'd left that house 4 months ago. I wasn't going to shrink myself again. "All right," I said, my voice steady. "Let's talk." I hung up the phone and stood there in the bookstore, the scent of old pages and fresh coffee grounding me. Michael's voice lingered in my ears, hesitant and unfamiliar, like a stranger trying to sound like my son. My hands shook as I set the phone down, but I took a deep breath and reminded myself of the promise I'd made at Tom's grave. I wasn't going to let them pull me back into the shadows. Not again. I finished arranging the display, a stack of novels about women starting over, and walked to the back room to tell Ruth I'd need a day off. "Family business," I said, and she raised an eyebrow but didn't pry. "You've got this, Margaret," she said, squeezing my arm. I wished I felt as sure as she sounded. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the notebook open in front of me. I didn't write. I just stared at the pages, at the words I'd poured out over the last 4 months, my dreams, my memories, my quiet rebellion against being forgotten. I thought about Michael's call, about what he might want. The house, he'd said. Of course it was the house. It was always about what I could give, never about what I needed. I closed the notebook and went to bed, but sleep didn't come. I lay there, the locket cool against my chest, and thought about Tom. He'd always known how to steady me, how to make me laugh when the world felt too heavy. "You're tougher than you think, Maggie," he'd say, and I clung to those words, now whispering them to myself in the dark. The next morning, I drove back to the town I'd left behind. The road felt different, like I was crossing a bridge I'd burned. I didn't go straight to the house. Instead, I stopped at the diner where Tom and I used to have breakfast on Sundays. It hadn't changed, the same red vinyl booths, the same jukebox playing old country tunes. I ordered coffee and sat by the window watching the street I'd walked 1,000 times. A woman approached my table, her hair gray like mine, her smile warm. "Margaret, is that you?" It was Lila, a friend from years ago, back when Michael was in school and we'd organize bake sales together. We hadn't spoken in a decade, not since life pulled us in different directions. She slid into the booth across from me, her eyes crinkling. "Where have you been? I heard you left town." I hesitated, the weight of the last 4 months pressing against my ribs. But Lila's kindness, the way she leaned in like she really wanted to know, loosened something in me. I told her everything, not the polished version, but the raw, jagged truth. Michael's words, Karen's coldness, the photo albums, the motel, the bookstore, the paintings. I told her how I'd felt invisible, how I'd started to find myself again. She listened, her hand resting on mine, and when I finished, she shook her head. "You didn't deserve that, Margaret. Not one bit. But you're still here, and that's something they can't take away." We talked for hours, the coffee growing cold. Lila told me about her own life, her husband's passing her daughter's move across the country, the way she'd felt alone until she started volunteering at the community center. "It's not about being needed," she said. "It's about being you and letting that be enough." Her words echoed Ruth's, and I felt that flicker of hope again, stronger now, like a flame that wouldn't go out. Before we parted, Lila hugged me tight. "Come to the community center sometime," she said. "We could use someone like you." I promised I would, and as I drove away, I felt lighter, like I'd reclaimed another piece of myself. When I pulled up to the house, my stomach knotted. It looked the same, white shutters, rose bushes I'd planted, the porch swing Tom built, but it felt different, like a place I'd outgrown. Michael's car was in the driveway, and I braced myself as I knocked. He opened the door, his face a mix of surprise and something else, guilt maybe. "Mom," he said, stepping aside. "Come in." Karen was in the living room holding a glass of water, her expression guarded. The kids weren't there, and the house was quiet, too quiet. I sat on the couch, the one I'd picked out with Tom, and waited. Michael cleared his throat. "We've been thinking about the house," he said, avoiding my eyes. "It's too big for you to manage alone, and with the kids growing, we could use the equity. We thought maybe you'd sell it, move somewhere smaller. We'd help you find a place." Karen nodded, her smile tight. "Somewhere nice, Margaret. A senior community, maybe? You'd have people your age." I stared at them, my heart pounding. They weren't asking me to leave this time. They were telling me dressing it up as concern. I thought about the years I'd spent in this house, the meals I'd cooked, the nights I'd sat up worrying about Michael, the way Tom and I had dreamed of growing old here. And now they wanted to sell it to take what was mine and call it theirs. I felt anger rising hot and sharp, but I didn't let it spill. Not yet. "This is my home," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not selling." Michael sighed like I was being stubborn. "Mom, be reasonable. You don't need all this space. It's just you." There it was again, just you. I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who didn't know me, who'd never bothered to. I stood up, my hands steady now. "I'll think about it," I said, because I knew arguing wouldn't change them. But as I walked out, I made another promise to myself. They wouldn't take this from me. Not the house, not my dignity, not the life I was building. Back in my apartment, I painted. Not flowers this time, but a storm dark clouds, lightning a single tree standing tall. It was messy, raw, but it was mine, and it felt like a release. I started going to the community center with Lila helping with art classes for kids. Their laughter, their messy, paint-covered hands reminded me of Michael when he was small, and it hurt, but it also healed. I was good at this, I realized. I had something to give, something that mattered. The kids called me Miss Margaret, and their parents thanked me, their smiles genuine. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I didn't hear from Michael again, but I didn't expect to. I kept writing, kept painting, kept building a life that felt like mine. Ruth sold one of my paintings at the bookstore, then another. "You should have a show," she said, and I laughed, thinking she was joking. But she wasn't. She helped me organize a small exhibit, just a few canvases in the bookstore's back room. I was nervous, my palms sweaty as people walked through, but they stayed. They looked, they talked to me. A woman my age bought a painting of a sunrise, saying it reminded her of her mother. I cried in the bathroom afterward, not from sadness, but from pride. One evening, as I was locking up the bookstore, a letter came in the mail. It was from a lawyer, someone I didn't know. I opened it, my heart racing, and read the words that changed everything. It was about the house, about the trust Tom had set up before he died. I hadn't known the details. Tom handled the finances, and I'd trusted him. But there it was. In black and white, the house was mine, fully paid, and more than that, I controlled the trust that funded Michael's business. Tom had left it in my name, giving me the power to decide its future. I sat down the letter, trembling in my hands, and laughed a quiet, disbelieving laugh. All this time, they'd thought they could push me out, but I held the keys. I didn't call Michael. I didn't gloat. I just sat with the knowledge, letting it settle. I thought about Tom, about how he'd always believed in me, even when I doubted myself. I thought about the years I'd spent shrinking, trying to be what they needed. And I thought about the woman I was, now the one who painted storms and taught kids, and laughed with Lila. I wasn't ready to decide what to do with the trust, not yet. But I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let them erase me. The next week, I went back to the community center and started a new project, a mural for the kids' room, a big, bright scene of a garden with flowers and birds, and a sun that shone no matter what. I painted every day, losing myself in the colors, the brush strokes, the way the kids would peek in and gasp. One afternoon, a girl named Sophie, no more than 7, tugged at my sleeve. "Miss Margaret," she said, "you're really good at this." "Are you famous?" I laughed, ruffling her hair. "No, sweetheart," I said. "I'm just me." And for the first time, that felt like enough. I stood back from the mural, paint smudged on my cheek, and watched the garden come to life on the community center wall. The flowers bloomed in bursts of red and violet. The birds soared in arcs of blue, and the sun, oh, the sun glowed golden, casting light over everything. Sophie and the other kids ran in their sneakers, squeaking on the floor, their voices a chorus of awe. "Miss Margaret, it's so pretty," Sophie said, her eyes wide. I smiled, my chest tight with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. This was mine, not just the mural, but the joy it brought, the way it made me feel alive. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was creating, building, mattering. That evening, I walked back to my apartment, the air cool against my skin. The street was quiet, the bookstore's windows glowing softly below my place. I climbed the stairs, my legs tired but my heart full, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The letter from the lawyer was still there, tucked under my notebook. I hadn't touched it since I'd first read it, but its weight was always with me, like a secret I wasn't ready to share. I didn't need to open it to remember what it said. The house was mine, the trust was mine, and with it, a power I'd never known I had. Tom had given me that, not just a home, but a choice, a way to stand tall when the world tried to push me down. I sipped my tea and thought about Michael, about Karen, about the life I'd left behind. I didn't hate them, not really. Hate was too heavy, too consuming. What I felt was something else, disappointment maybe mixed with a quiet resolve. They'd made their choices, and now I was making mine. I opened my notebook and started writing not about the past this time, but about the mural, about Sophie's smile, about the way the paint felt under my brush. I wrote until the words blurred, until my hand ached, and when I stopped, I felt lighter, like I'd let go of something I'd been carrying too long. The next morning, Ruth called me down to the bookstore. "You've got a visitor," she said, her voice curious. I wiped my hands on my apron, still flecked with paint from the mural, and walked downstairs. There by the counter was Lila holding a small bouquet of daisies. "For you," she said, handing them over with a grin. "I saw your mural at the center." "Margaret, it's beautiful. You're beautiful." I blushed, the compliment catching me off guard. "It's just paint," I said. But she shook her head. "It's more than that. It's you showing the world who you are." We sat in the back room, the daisies in a vase between us, and talked over coffee. Lila told me about a friend of hers, a gallery owner in the next town who was looking for local artists. "You should show her your work," Lila said. "Your paintings, the ones in the bookstore, they're special." I laughed, nervous. "I'm not an artist, Lila. I'm just me." She leaned forward, her eyes steady. "That's exactly why they're special. They're honest. They're you." I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. The idea of showing my paintings to a stranger, of letting them see the storms and sunrises I'd poured onto canvas, felt terrifying. But it also felt like a door opening, a chance to step into a life I'd never dared to imagine. I thanked Lila, promised to think about it, and spent the rest of the day shelving books, my mind spinning. Could I do it? Could I let the world see me, not as Michael's mother or Tom's widow, but as Margaret, the woman who painted her heart? That night, I pulled out my canvases, the ones I'd tucked away in the closet. There was the storm I'd painted after Michael's call, all dark clouds and lightning. There was the sunrise I'd done after the bookstore exhibit, soft pinks and golds bleeding into blue. There was a new one, unfinished, of a woman standing in a garden, her face half hidden, her hands reaching for the sky. I didn't know if they were good, but they were mine, and that was enough to make me pick up the phone and call Lila. "Tell your friend I'll meet her," I said, my voice shaking. She whooped so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and I laughed, feeling a spark of courage I hadn't known I had. The gallery owner, Claire, came to the bookstore a week later. She was younger than I'd expected, with sharp eyes and a warm smile. She looked at my paintings, not rushing, not judging, just seeing. When she finished, she turned to me and said, "Margaret, these tell a story. I'd like to show them in my gallery. Not just one or two, a whole exhibit. Your story." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "I'm not sure I'm ready," I admitted, but she shook her head. "You're ready. You just don't know it yet." I said yes, because something in her voice reminded me of Tom, of the way he'd always believed in me. The next few weeks were a blur, framing paintings, choosing which ones to show, writing little cards with their titles. I called the exhibit After the Rain because that's what it felt like, this new life I was building. The gallery was small but cozy, with white walls and soft lighting, and when I saw my paintings hung up, I had to blink back tears. They looked different there, not just mine anymore, but something bigger, something that could touch others. The opening night was quiet, just a few dozen people, Lila, Ruth, some folks from the community center, and strangers I didn't know. I wore a simple blue dress, the locket around my neck, and stood by the wall, my hands clasped tight. People walked through, pausing at each painting, whispering to each other. A woman my age stopped in front of the storm, painting, her eyes wet. "This is how it feels," she said almost to herself. "Losing someone, but finding yourself." I knotted my throat too tight to speak and realized this was what Claire meant. My story wasn't just mine, it was theirs too. I sold 3 paintings that night, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the way people looked at me, not as an old woman to be pitied, but as someone with something to say. Lila hugged me as we left, her voice fierce. "You did it, Margaret. You showed them." I smiled, but inside I was thinking about Michael, about Karen, about the family who'd tried to erase me. They hadn't seen this. They didn't know this, Margaret. And maybe they never would. The next day I got another call from Michael. I was in the bookstore dusting shelves when my phone buzzed. His voice was different this time, urgent, almost desperate. "Mom, we need to talk. It's important. Can you come to the house?" I paused the duster in my hand and felt that old pull, the one that used to make me drop everything for him. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "I'm busy," I said, my voice calm. "What's this about?" He hesitated, then said, "The business. We're having some issues. Can you just come?" I knew what he meant. The trust. He must have found out, or at least suspected, that I held the strings. I felt a flicker of power, but it wasn't joy. It was sadness for the boy he'd been, for the man he'd become. "I'll come tomorrow," I said, and hung up before he could argue. I didn't tell Ruth or Lila. This was something I had to face alone. That night, I sat with the lawyer's letter again. I read it carefully, every word, and then I called the lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Evans who'd known Tom. "I want to understand my options," I said. He explained it all, the trust, the house, the business. Tom had set it up so I had full control, not just of the money, but of what happened to it. I could keep funding Michael's business, or I could stop. I could sell the house, or I could stay. It was my choice and mine alone. I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. I didn't want revenge, but I wanted justice, not the loud, angry kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that spoke for itself. The next morning, I drove to the house. Michael was waiting on the porch. Karen beside him, their faces tense. I walked up the steps, my head high, the locket warm against my skin. "Let's talk inside," I said, and they followed me like I was the one in charge. We sat in the living room, the same couch, the same yellow walls, but I wasn't the same. I looked at Michael, at the worry in his eyes, and waited. "Mom," he started, his voice low, "the business is in trouble. We need the trust money to keep it going. Dad set it up for us, for the family." Karen nodded, her hands folded tight. "We're just asking for what's fair," she said. I let their words hang in the air, heavy and sharp. Then I leaned forward, my voice steady. "The trust is mine," I said. "Tom left it to me. Not to you, not to the business. To me." Michael's face changed, shock giving way to something like fear. "Mom, you can't. You wouldn't." I held up a hand, silencing him. "I've given you everything I said. My time, my love, my home. And you told me to leave. You told me I didn't belong." Karen looked away, her cheeks red, but Michael stared at me, his mouth open. I didn't yell, didn't cry. I just spoke my words clear and true. I'm not here to punish you, but I'm not here to save you either. I'm here to live my life, the one you didn't think mattered. I stood up, my hands steady, my heart calm. I'll think about the trust, I said, but not because you asked, because I choose to. I walked out their silence loud behind me and drove back to my apartment, the road stretching wide and open before me. I drove back to my apartment with the windows down, the summer air warm against my face. The road hummed under the tires, and for the first time in a long time, I felt unburdened, like I'd left something heavy behind in that living room. Michael's shock. Karen's silence. They weren't my responsibility anymore. I'd spent years carrying their needs, their wants, their dismissals. But now at 67, I was carrying myself. The locket bounced softly against my chest, and I thought of Tom, of the way he'd smile when I stood up for myself, rare as those moments were back then. "That's my Maggie," he'd say, and I could almost hear him now cheering me on from somewhere beyond the stars. When I got home, I didn't go straight inside. I sat on the steps outside the bookstore, watching the street come alive with evening kids on bikes, couples walking hand in hand, an old man feeding pigeons on a bench. It was ordinary, but it felt sacred, like a life I'd fought to claim. I thought about the trust, about the house, about the choices I now held. I didn't want to hurt Michael, not really. He was still my son, still the boy I'd sung to sleep, even if he'd forgotten that. But I couldn't keep giving pieces of myself to people who didn't see me. I deserved more. I deserved this. The steps, the bookstore, the mural, the paintings, the life I was building, brushstroke by brushstroke. Inside, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the lawyer's letter in front of me. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. I knew what it meant, power not to destroy, but to decide. I opened my notebook instead and wrote not about Michael or the house, but about the mural, about the way Sophie's face lit up when she saw the birds. I wrote about Lila's daisies, about Claire's gallery, about the woman who'd cried at my storm painting. I wrote until my wrist ached, until the page was full, and then I closed the notebook and went to bed. For the first time in months, I slept through the night, no dreams, just peace. The next morning, I woke early and went to the community center. The mural was nearly done, just a few touches, left a shadow under a flower, a glint on a wing. I painted slowly, savoring each stroke, the kids' laughter echoing from the next room. Lila stopped by, her arms full of craft supplies. "You're glowing, Margaret," she said, setting the boxes down. I laughed, wiping paint from my hands. "I'm just painting," I said. But she shook her head. "It's more than that. You're free. Free." The word stayed with me all day like a melody I couldn't shake. I thought about it as I finished the mural, as I ate lunch with Lila, as I walked back to the bookstore to help Ruth with a new shipment. Free wasn't just about leaving the house or standing up to Michael. It was about choosing myself over and over, even when it hurt, even when it scared me. It was about painting storms and sunrises, about teaching kids, about letting my heart be seen. It was about being Margaret, not just a mother, a widow, a burden. That afternoon, Claire called. "The exhibit's getting attention," she said, her voice excited. "A couple of local papers want to write about you, and there's a buyer interested in the garden painting the one with the woman." I froze, the phone heavy in my hand. The garden painting was my favorite, the one I'd left unfinished for weeks, because it felt too personal, too raw. The woman in it wasn't me. Not exactly, but she was every woman I'd been. The girl who dreamed the wife, who loved the mother, who gave the widow, who grieved the artist who rose. "I'm not sure I want to sell that one," I said, and Claire laughed. I figured. "But you should know, Margaret, people are talking. Your work, it's touching them." I thanked her, my heart racing, and hung up. People are talking. I didn't know what to do with that, but it felt like a gift, like the world was finally seeing me. I went to the gallery that evening just to look at the paintings again. The space was empty, the lights low, and I walked slowly, letting each canvas tell its story. The storm, the sunrise, the garden, they weren't just paint. They were my life, my heart, my truth. I stopped at the garden painting at the woman reaching for the sky and whispered, "You did it." Not to her, but to me. The next day, I called Mr. Evans, the lawyer. "I've made a decision," I said. We met at his office, a small, tidy space with bookshelves and a window overlooking the park. He listened as I told him what I wanted, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I wasn't going to sell the house. It was mine, and I might live in it again someday, or I might not. But it wasn't theirs to take. The trust was trickier. Michael's business relied on it, and cutting it off would hurt him. Karen, the kids. I didn't want to be cruel, but I didn't want to be invisible either. I want to redirect the funds I said, not all at once, but over time, to the community center, to art programs for kids. And I want to set up a scholarship for women like me, older, starting over. Mr. Evans nodded his pen, moving across his notepad. "It's your trust, Margaret. You can do whatever you want with it." He paused, his eyes kind. Tom would be proud. I smiled, my throat tight, and signed the papers he prepared. It wasn't revenge, but it was justice, quiet, steady mine. The business would get enough to stay afloat for a while, but not forever. Michael would have to figure out the rest, just like I had. I didn't tell him. I didn't need to. The changes would happen slowly, and when they did, he'd know. Instead, I went back to the community center and started planning the art program, talking to Lila about supplies space teachers. The kids were thrilled, Sophie especially tugging at my sleeve to show me her own drawing of flower, lopsided but bright. "For you, Miss Margaret," she said, and I hugged her, my heart full. Weeks passed, and my life grew richer, fuller. The gallery exhibit ended, but Claire kept 2 of my paintings on display, and one sold to a collector from out of state. The local paper ran a story calling me a late-blooming artist with a story to tell. I blushed reading it, but I kept the clipping, tucking it into my notebook. I painted more, taught more, laughed more. Lila and Ruth became my family, not the kind you're born into, but the kind you choose. The community center mural was finished, and we had a little party to celebrate with cake and music and kids running wild. I stood by the wall watching the garden glow under the lights and felt whole. One morning, as I was setting up for an art class, my phone rang. It was Michael again. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. His voice was quiet, strained. "Mom, I got a letter from the lawyer about the trust." I waited, letting him speak. You're taking it away. The business, we can't survive without it." I heard Karen in the background, her voice sharp, but Michael shushed her. "Why, Mom? Why would you do this?" I took a breath, my hand steady on the phone. "Michael," I said, "I gave you everything I had for years. My love, my time, my home. And you told me I didn't belong. The trust is mine, and I'm using it to build something that matters to me. You'll have to find your own way like I did." He was silent, and for a moment I thought he'd hung up. Then he said, I didn't know. I didn't argue, didn't explain." "I hope you figure it out," I said, and hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry or sad or guilty. I felt calm, like I'd closed a door I'd left open too long. I went back to the art class to Sophie and the other kids and taught them how to mix colors, how to make a sky. That evening, I painted again a new canvas, not a storm or a sunrise, but a path winding through a field leading somewhere I couldn't see. It felt right, like a promise to myself to keep going, to keep choosing me. The community center program grew, and I poured myself into it, teaching, planning, dreaming. Lila helped, and so did Ruth, and soon we had a waiting list of kids, of women, of people who wanted to create, to heal, to start over. I didn't hear from Michael again, but I heard through a neighbor that the business was struggling, that he and Karen were fighting. I didn't gloat. I just kept living, kept painting, kept writing in my notebook. The house sat empty, but I wasn't ready to go back. Maybe I never would be. It was mine, and that was enough. One day, as I was leaving the community center, Sophie ran up and handed me a card. It was handmade, covered in glitter and hearts. Inside, she'd written, Thank you, Miss Margaret, for making everything pretty. I hugged her tight, my eyes wet, and took the card home, placing it next to Lila's daisies, now dried and pressed in a frame. I looked around my apartment at the paintings, the notebook, the locket on the nightstand, and realized I was home. Not the house, not the past, but here now, in this life I'd built. I didn't need their photos, their approval, their love. I had mine, and it was enough. The days folded into weeks, each one a brushstroke on the canvas of my new life. I woke early, the light filtering through my apartment's small window, painting the walls gold. I'd make coffee, sit at the kitchen table, and write in my notebook, not just memories or dreams now, but plans. Plans for the art program, for new paintings, for trips I wanted to take. I'd always wanted to see the ocean again, to feel the sand between my toes, like Tom and I did on our honeymoon. The thought made me smile, not with sadness, but with possibility. At 67, I was learning that life wasn't over until you decided it was. The community center became my anchor. The art program grew, and we added evening classes for adults, women like me, some younger, some older, all carrying their own stories of loss or reinvention. I taught them to paint, not just colors on canvas, but the things they felt too afraid to say. One woman, Ellen, painted a cracked vase, its pieces held together with gold. "It's me," she said, her voice soft, broken, but still here. I hugged her, my heart swelling, because I knew that feeling knew what it took to keep going. The kids' classes were louder, messier, full of laughter and spilled paint. Sophie was my shadow, always at my side, asking questions, showing me her latest drawings. "When I grow up, I want to be like you, Miss Margaret," she said one day, and I had to turn away, my eyes burning, because no one had ever said that to me before. Lila and Ruth were my constants, my family in a way Michael and Karen never were. Lila would drag me to the diner for pie, teasing me about my fancy artist life now that the gallery had sold another painting. Ruth kept my paintings in the bookstore, a quiet pride in her eyes every time someone asked about them. "That's Margaret's work," she'd say, and I'd blush, still unused to the attention. Claire, the gallery owner, called now and then, talking about another exhibit maybe in a bigger town. "You're ready for it," she said, and I was starting to believe her. But the past wasn't done with me. One afternoon, as I was setting up easels at the community center, a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. Michael's car. My stomach tightened, but I kept working my hands steady as I arranged paintbrushes. He walked in alone, his shoulders hunched, his face older than I remembered. "Mom," he said, stopping a few feet away. I looked at him, at the man who'd once been my little boy, and waited. "Can we talk?" He asked, his voice low. I nodded, leading him to a quiet corner away from the kids' chatter. He sat across from me, his hands fidgeting, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. "The business is failing," he said, not meeting my eyes. "The trust money, it's gone now, isn't it? You redirected it." I didn't flinch, didn't apologize. "Yes," I said. "I told you I would. It's going to the community center, to programs for kids, for women. It's doing good, Michael." He swallowed, his jaw tight. "We're losing everything. The house, the business, all of it. Karen's furious. She says it's my fault, that I should have, fixed this." I listened, letting his words settle. I felt a pang for him, for the kids, but it wasn't the same ache I used to carry. I wasn't his savior anymore. "Michael?" I said, my voice calm. "I gave you years of my life. I gave you a home, love, everything I had, and you told me to leave. You made me feel like I didn't matter. I had to find my own way, and I did. Now you have to find yours." He looked at me, then really looked, and I saw something shift in his eyes, regret maybe, or understanding. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking. I thought it was what we needed. I thought you'd be okay." I shook my head, not angrily, but firmly. "You didn't think about me at all. That's the problem." He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just sat there, his hands clasped, and I realized he wasn't here to fight. He was here because he had nowhere else to go. I could have softened, could have offered comfort, but I didn't. Not because I was cruel, but because I was done carrying his weight. "You're not a boy anymore," I said. "You have a family responsibilities. Figure it out like I did. It's hard, but it's possible." He nodded slow, like he was hearing me for the first time. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, and I believed him, but sorry wasn't enough. Not yet. He left after that, his car disappearing down the street. I went back to the easels, to the kids, to the life I'd built. I didn't cry, didn't dwell. I painted with Sophie, laughed with Lila, ate dinner with Ruth. The trust was gone from Michael's business, redirected to the community center, to scholarships, to things that mattered. The house was still mine, and I'd decided not to sell it. Not out of spite, but because it was part of me. Part of Tom, part of the life we'd dreamed. I might go back one day, or I might not. It was my choice, and that was power enough. The next week, Claire called with news. A gallery in the city an hour away wanted to host After the Rain. Not just a few paintings, but a full exhibit with a reception press, the works. "This is big, Margaret," she said. "You're ready." I laughed nervous, but said yes because I was ready, even if I was scared. We spent weeks preparing, choosing paintings, writing a bio. I wrote it myself, not as Michael's mother or Tom's widow, but as Margaret artist teacher survivor. Margaret's work, I wrote, is a testament to finding light after loss, to the quiet strength of starting over. The night of the city exhibit, I wore the blue dress again, the locket shining against it. The gallery was bigger, brighter, filled with people I didn't know, art lovers, critics, locals. Lila and Ruth were there beaming, and Sophie came with her mom holding a new drawing she'd made for me. I walked through the crowd, my heart pounding, but my head high. People stopped me, asked about the paintings, about my story. A critic from a local paper said my work was raw, honest, a voice for women who've been overlooked. I thanked him, my voice steady, and thought, this is what it feels like to be seen. The garden painting was there, the woman reaching for the sky. I hadn't sold it, couldn't, but I'd finished it, her face clearer now, her hands strong. A woman my age stood in front of it, tears in her eyes. "This is me," she said, echoing Ellen's words from the community center. "Thank you." I hugged her, my own eyes wet, and realized this was why I painted not for money or fame, but for this, for connection, for truth. The exhibit was a success. Paintings sold, articles were written, and Claire said it was just the beginning. I didn't know what that meant, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I went home to my apartment, to my notebook, to my life, and kept going. I taught, I painted, I dreamed. I took that trip to the ocean alone and stood on the shore, the waves kissing my feet, the locket warm against my skin. I thought of Tom, of the girl I'd been, of the woman I was now. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I didn't hear from Michael again, but I heard through Lila that he and Karen had sold their car, downsized, started working harder to save the business. I didn't know if they'd make it, and I didn't need to. They weren't my story anymore. My story was the community center, the kids, the women, the paintings, the ocean, the notebook full of plans. My story was me. One evening, as I sat on my steps watching the sunset, I took off the locket and held it in my hands. Tom's picture was still inside, his smile as bright as ever. We did it. I whispered not to him, but to us, to the life we'd built, to the woman I'd become. I didn't put the locket back on. Instead, I placed it in a small box with Sophie's card, Lila's daisies, the newspaper clipping. Not to forget, but to honor. I was more than Tom's widow, more than Michael's mother. I was Margaret, and that was enough. I went inside, picked up a new canvas, and started painting a horizon wide and open, full of light. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I'd follow it one brushstroke at a time. The horizon on my canvas stretched endless, a blend of amber and violet, where the sky kissed the earth. I painted late into the night, the apartment quiet except for the soft scratch of my brush and the occasional hum of a car outside. It wasn't just a painting. It was a promise, a map of where I was going, even if I didn't know the destination. I was 67, and for the first time, I wasn't living for anyone else. Not Tom, not Michael, not the family who'd pushed me out of their photos. I was living for me, and every stroke of paint felt like a declaration: I am here. I matter. The next morning, I woke to a voicemail from Claire. "Margaret, you're not going to believe this," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. "The city exhibit caught the eye of a curator from a museum." "Yes, a museum. They want to feature your work in a group show next spring. Women Artists Stories of Resilience. You're in." I played the message again, then a third time, my coffee growing cold. A museum, my paintings, my storms, my sunrises, my gardens seen by thousands. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling, and laughed a sound that was half joy, half disbelief. I called Claire back, my voice shaking. "Are you sure they want me?" I asked, and she laughed. "Margaret, they don't just want you. They need you." The news felt too big, like a dress I wasn't sure I could wear. But I said yes, because I'd learned that saying yes, even when I was scared, was how I'd gotten here, to this apartment, this life, this moment. Claire and I started planning choosing paintings, talking about new pieces for the show. "They want something fresh," she said. "Something that shows where you are now." I nodded, already seeing it in my mind. Not a storm, not a sunrise, but a woman walking a path. Her shadow long behind her, her face turned toward light. I didn't know if I could paint it, but I knew I had to try. The community center kept me grounded. The art program was thriving with more kids and adults signing up every week. Sophie was working on a series of drawings she called Miss Margaret's Garden, all flowers and birds, inspired by the mural. I pinned them up in the classroom, my heart swelling every time I saw them. The adult classes were just as alive women painting their truths: grief, hope, anger, love. Ellen, who'd painted the cracked vase, brought in a new piece, a tree with roots deep in the earth. "It's me now," she said, her smile shy but strong, still growing. I hugged her because I knew that growth knew how hard it was to keep reaching for the light. Lila and Ruth were my cheerleaders, dragging me to the diner to celebrate the museum news. "You're a star," Margaret Lila said, raising her coffee mug like it was champagne. Ruth grinned, her eyes crinkling. "You're not just a star, you're a whole damn constellation." I laughed, my cheeks warm, and for a moment I felt young, like the girl who danced with Tom under the stars. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was better, stronger, wiser mine. The weeks passed in a blur of paint and plans. I worked on the new painting for the museum, The Woman on the Path. It was harder than anything I'd painted before, because it was me, not the me I'd been, but the me I was becoming. I painted her hands first, strong and lined, reaching forward. Her face came last, half turned, her eyes steady, her mouth soft but sure. I didn't finish it, not yet. It felt like a conversation I wasn't done having, but every stroke brought me closer. One afternoon, as I was cleaning brushes at the community center, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, the envelope worn, postmarked from my old town. My heart skipped, thinking it was Michael, but the handwriting wasn't his. I opened it, my hands careful, and found a note from my neighbor, Mrs. Clara, the one I'd left my number with when I moved. "Dear Margaret," it read, "I've been meaning to write. I saw your name in the paper about your paintings. I'm so proud of you. Things here aren't the same since you left. Michael and Karen are struggling, but they're trying. I thought you should know. You're missed, even if they don't say it. Come back someday if you want. The roses are still blooming." I read it twice, then tucked it into my pocket. Clara's kindness warmed me, but her words about Michael and Karen stirred something complex, sadness maybe, or closure. I didn't miss them, not the way I used to. I missed the idea of them, the family I dreamed of, but that dream wasn't real anymore. The roses, though, those I missed. I'd planted them with Tom, tended them through every season. I closed my eyes and saw them red and full, climbing the porch. Maybe I'd go back just to see them. Maybe not. It was my choice, and that felt like freedom. That evening, I painted again not the woman on the path, but the roses. They spilled across the canvas, thorny and alive, their petals soft against the dusk. I didn't know if I'd show it, but it felt right, like honoring the life I'd left without being bound to it. I hung it in my apartment next to the storm, the sunrise, the garden. My walls were a story now, not of loss, but of survival, of bloom. The community center threw a winter party, a big one, with lights strung across the ceiling and music spilling into the halls. The kids performed a skit, Sophie playing a bird who learned to fly. The adults brought food, and I made Tom's favorite pecan pie, the recipe still in my heart. Lila danced with me to an old song, her laugh infectious, and Ruth told stories that had us all in stitches. I looked around at the faces I'd come to love and realized this was family, not the one I'd been born into, but the one I'd found. They saw me not as a mother or a widow, but as Margaret, and that was enough. The museum show loomed closer, and I finished the painting of the woman on the path. I called her forward because that's what she was moving, not looking back. Claire cried when she saw it, her hand on my arm. "This is it, Margaret," she said. "This is you. We sent it to the museum along with the storm, the sunrise, and the garden. I didn't go to the opening. I wasn't ready for the city, the crowds, the noise. But Claire sent me photos, and I read the reviews, my hands shaking. Margaret's work, one said, is a quiet revolution, a testament to the power of claiming your own story. I kept teaching, kept painting, kept living. The scholarship I'd set up with the trust money started, and the first recipient was a woman named Rose 62, who'd always wanted to study art but never had the chance. She came to the community center to thank me, her eyes wet. "You changed my life," she said, and I hugged her because she'd changed mine too. The art program grew, and we got a grant enough to hire another teacher. I didn't need the house, the trust, the past. I had this, and it was more than enough. One spring morning, I drove back to the house. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. The roses were blooming, just as Clara said, their scent, heavy in the air. The house looked smaller, quieter, like it was waiting. I didn't go inside. I just stood on the porch, my hand on the swing Tom built, and said goodbye, not to the house, but to the weight I'd carried. I left a note for Clara, thanking her, and drove away, the roses bright in my rearview mirror. Back in my apartment, I started a new painting, a horizon again, but this time with a figure small but steady, walking toward it. I didn't know where she was going, but I knew she'd get there. I hung it above my bed, a reminder of the path I was on. I kept the locket in its box, with Sophie's card, Lila's daisies, the newspaper clipping, and now Clara's letter. They weren't my story. They were pieces of it, and I was still writing the rest. I didn't hear from Michael or Karen, and I didn't need to. I heard from Sophie, from Ellen, from Rose, from Lila and Ruth and Claire. I heard from the women in my classes, from the kids who hugged me, from the strangers who saw my paintings and felt something. I heard from myself, loudest of all, telling me to keep going, to keep choosing me. One evening, as I sat on my steps watching the stars, I thought about the family photos I'd never be in. They didn't want me in their memories, and that was okay. I was making my own brighter, truer mine. I went inside, picked up my notebook, and wrote one last thing, not a plan, not a memory, but a truth. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. I closed the notebook, my heart calm, and went to the community center the next day. Sophie was waiting, her latest drawing in hand, a tree, its branches full of stars. "For you," she said, and I took it, my smile wide. I hung it in the classroom next to her garden and started a new class teaching kids to paint their own skies. As I handed out brushes, I felt Tom's locket in my heart, not around my neck, but in me, steady and sure. I was Margaret, and I was whole. The stars in Sophie's drawing twinkled on the community center wall, their edges smudged with crayon. But to me, they were as bright as the ones I'd watched from my steps the night before. I stood in the classroom surrounded by the hum of kids mixing paint, their voices a soft chaos of excitement. Sophie was at her easel tongue poking out as she added more stars to her latest piece. I walked over, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You've got a whole galaxy there," I said, and she grinned, her eyes sparkling. "It's for you, Miss Margaret, so you never forget you're shiny." I laughed, my heart so full it hurt, and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. Shiny. I'd never thought of myself that way, but in her eyes I was, and that was a gift I'd carry forever. The classroom was alive with color reds and blues, streaking across canvases, laughter bouncing off the walls. The adult class would come later, women like Ellen and Rose, painting their way through grief or joy or both. This was my world now, not the house I'd left, not the family who'd pushed me out, but this place, these people, this life I'd built from the ashes of what was. I moved through the room, offering tips, wiping spills, feeling the rhythm of it all like a heartbeat. I was 67 and I was home. That afternoon, Lila stopped by with a thermos of tea and a grin. "You're famous now, you know," she said, plopping into a chair. I rolled my eyes, handing her a mug. "Hardly. It's just a museum show," she snorted, pouring the tea. "Just a museum show," she says. "Margaret, you're in a museum. Your paintings are telling stories to people you'll never meet. That's not small." I sat across from her, the steam curling between us, and let her words sink in. She was right. It wasn't small. It was everything, not because it was grand, but because it was mine. We talked about the museum show, about the new painting I was working on for it, The Woman on the Path. Forward, I'd called her, and every time I worked on it, I felt her strength, her quiet resolve. Lila leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "You should go to the opening this time," she said. "Not just send the paintings. Be there. Let them see you." I hesitated, the idea daunting. The city, the crowds, the eyes on me, it felt like too much. But then I thought of Sophie's stars, of Ellen's Tree of Roses scholarship. I'd faced harder things than a room full of strangers. Maybe I said, and Lila grinned like she'd already won. The days slipped by, each one layered with paint and purpose. I taught, I painted, I wrote in my notebook not just plans now, but reflections, pieces of myself I was still discovering. I wrote about the roses I'd seen at the house, about the way they'd bloomed despite everything. I wrote about the locket safe in its box, a piece of Tom I'd carry but no longer needed to wear. I wrote about the woman I was becoming, not perfect, but whole, and every word felt like a step on that path I'd painted. One morning, as I was setting up for class, a package arrived at the community center. It was small, wrapped in brown paper with my name in careful script. No return address. I opened it at the front desk, curious, and found a leather-bound book, its cover soft with age. Inside was a note, the handwriting shaky but clear. "Margaret, I found this in my attic. It was your mother's. I thought you should have it. Clara." My breath caught. Clara, my old neighbor, the one who'd written about the roses. I turned the book over my fingers, tracing the embossed flowers on the cover. It was a journal, my mother's, from before I was born. I took it home that night, too fragile to open in front of anyone. I sat at my kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm glow and read. Her words were like a song, stories of her youth, her dreams, her fears. She'd wanted to be a writer, I learned, but life had other plans. She wrote about love, about my father, about the world she hoped I'd see. On the last page, she'd written, "For my daughter, whoever you become, you are enough." I closed the book, my eyes wet, and held it to my chest. My mother, gone since I was young, had seen me even then. I added the journal to my box with the locket, Sophie's card, Lila's daisies, Clara's letter. Not relics, but roots grounding me as I grew. The museum show was a month away, and I decided Lila was right. I'd go. I worked on forward, adding final touches, a glint in her eyes, a shadow on the path, a sky that felt alive. Claire helped me prepare, picking out a dress, not blue this time, but green, the color of new leaves. "You're going to shine," she said, and I believed her, not because I was special, but because I was me. I kept teaching, kept painting, kept living. But the show loomed like a horizon pulling me forward. One evening, as I was locking up the community center, a car pulled up. I knew it before I saw it Michael's. He stepped out alone again, his face tired, his hands in his pockets. "Mom," he said, and I nodded, leaning against the door. "What is it, Michael?" He shuffled, looking at the ground. "I wanted to see you. To talk." I waited, my heart steady. I wasn't afraid of him anymore, not his words, not his silence. He took a breath, his voice low. "The business is gone. We lost it. Karen and we're selling the house, moving somewhere smaller. The kids are okay, but it's hard." He looked at me, his eyes searching. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. I didn't see you, not really. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know if it means anything now, but I am." I listened, letting his words settle. They were heavy, but they didn't cut like they used to. I saw him not as the man who'd pushed me out, but as a boy who'd lost his way trying to find it again. "Michael," I said, my voice soft but firm, "I forgive you. Not because you asked, but because I need to. But forgiveness doesn't mean going back. I have a life now, one I built without you. I hope you find yours for you, for the kids." He nodded, his eyes wet, and I saw the boy I'd loved, the one who'd clung to me. But I didn't reach for him. I didn't need to. "Take care, Michael," I said, and walked to my car, the night cool against my skin. I didn't look back. I drove home, painted until dawn, and slept with Forward watching over me. The museum show came, and I went, Lila and Ruth at my side, Sophie and her mom cheering from the crowd. The room was full, the lights bright, my paintings alive on the walls. I stood by Forward, the woman on the path, and people came not just to see, but to talk. They told me their stories, mothers, widows, women who'd started over. I listened, my heart open, and realized this was my legacy, not a house or a trust, but this connection, this truth. The show was a success, but it was the moments after the hugs, the tears, the stories that stayed with me. I went home, not to the house, but to my apartment, to my notebook, to my life. I painted more, taught, more loved, more. The community center grew. The scholarship helped more women, and Sophie kept drawing stars. I saw the ocean again, walked the shore, and felt Tom in the waves, not gone, but part of me. One day, I went back to the community center and planted a rose bush by the mural, its roots deep in the earth. I didn't need the house's roses anymore. I had my own. I stood back, dirt on my hands, and smiled. My worth wasn't in who accepted me, but in how I honored myself. I was Margaret, and I was enough. I was. The rosebush stood small but proud by the community center mural, its leaves catching the morning light. I knelt beside it, my hands still dusted with soil, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my bones. It wasn't just a plant, it was a marker, a piece of the life I'd claimed rooted in the here and now. The kids ran past, their laughter spilling into the air, and Sophie waved her latest drawing tucked under her arm. "Miss Margaret, is that your rose?" she called, and I nodded, smiling. "It's ours," I said, and she beamed, already planning to draw it. I stood brushing dirt from my knees and looked at the mural, my garden, my birds, my sun. This was my place, not borrowed or begged for, but built, and it was enough. I walked inside the community center, buzzing with its usual rhythm, kids painting, adults chatting, the smell of coffee and acrylics mingling in the air. The art program had grown so much, we'd started a waiting list, and I'd hired a second teacher, a young woman named Mia, who brought her own spark to the classes. I taught less now, not because I wanted to, but because I was painting more, preparing for the museum show's next phase, a traveling exhibit Claire had said to other cities, other states. The idea still felt surreal, like a dream I hadn't meant to dream, but I was ready, or as ready as I'd ever be. That afternoon, I sat with Lila at the diner, our usual spot by the window. She was flipping through a magazine, pointing out an article about the museum show. "Look at this, Margaret," she said, tapping a photo of Forward, the woman on the path. "They're calling you a voice for resilience. You're famous." I laughed, sipping my coffee. I'm just painting what I know I said, but she shook her head, her eyes serious. You're doing more than that. You're showing people, women like us, that it's never too late. That's big. Her words stayed with me heavy and warm as I drove home. I thought about the women in my classes, Ellen with her tree rose, with her scholarship, the others who painted their pain and their hope. I thought about my mother's journal, her words echoing across decades, "You are enough." I thought about Tom, about the locket, about the roses I'd left behind, and the one I'd planted today. My life wasn't just mine anymore. It was a thread in a tapestry, woven with others, and that made it bigger, truer, more. At home, I opened my notebook not to write, but to read. I flipped through the pages, tracing the journey I'd written. Grief, anger, hope, strength. The early entries were raw, full of the pain of Michael's words, Karen's coldness, the photo albums that cut me out. The later ones were different, lighter, bolder, full of Sophie's stars, Lila's laughter, the paintings that had become my voice. I closed the notebook and looked at the walls, at the storm, the sunrise, the garden, the roses, the horizon. They weren't just art, they were me, and I wasn't done painting. The next day I got a call from Claire. "Margaret, the museum's adding a talk to the traveling exhibit," she said. "They want you to speak, tell your story. Not just about the paintings, but about you." My stomach knotted, the idea of standing in front of strangers, bearing my heart, more daunting than any gallery. "I'm not a speaker," I said, but she laughed. "You're a storyteller. You do it every time you paint, every time you teach. Just be you." I didn't say yes, not right away, but I promised to think about it, and that night I painted a small canvas, just a hand holding a brush, the background soft, like dawn. It was practice, I told myself, for saying yes. The community center kept me busy, grounding me as the museum plans grew. Sophie finished her rose drawing, a burst of red and green that I hung by the mural. Ellen brought in a new painting, a river flowing through a forest, and said, "It's peace, Margaret. I found it because of you." Rose stopped by her first semester of art school behind her, her eyes bright with stories of color and light. "I'm painting because you did," she said, and I hugged her, my throat tight. These were my people, my purpose, and no one could take that away. One evening, as I was locking up the bookstore, a letter slipped through the mail slot. It was from Michael, the handwriting unsteady, the envelope plain. I took it upstairs, my heart calm, and opened it at the kitchen table. "Mom," it read. "I don't know if you'll read this, but I need to write it. We're in a new place now, smaller, but it's okay. The kids are adjusting, and Karen and I are trying. I think about what you said about finding my own way. I'm trying. I see you now in the papers, in the art. I didn't before, and I'm sorry. I don't expect anything, but I hope you're happy. You deserve it. Michael." I read it again, then set it down. I didn't cry, didn't feel the old ache. I felt still like a lake after a storm. His words were honest, maybe the most honest he'd ever been, but they didn't change what was. I forgave him not for him, but for me, and I'd moved on. I tucked the letter into the box with the locket, Sophie's card, Lila's daisies, Clara's letter, my mother's journal. It was part of my story, but not the whole of it. The next morning I called Claire. "I'll do the talk," I said, my voice steady. She whooped and I laughed, feeling the fear and the courage tangled together. I started preparing not a speech, but a story mine, raw and true. I wrote it in my notebook, practiced it in front of the mirror, told it to Lila and Ruth over pie. "You're going to make them cry," Lila said, and Ruth nodded, "and make them stand taller." I hoped they were right. The traveling exhibit opened in a new city, and I went the green dress soft against my skin, forward glowing on the wall. The room was full faces I didn't know, but their eyes were kind, curious, waiting. I stood at the podium, my hands steady, and told my story, not just the paintings, but the pain, the leaving, the rebuilding. I told them about Michael, about the house, about the roses, about Sophie and Ellen and Rose. I told them about the woman on the path, about choosing myself. The room was quiet, then loud with applause, and afterward women came to me, their hands clasping mine, their stories spilling out. "You gave me hope," one said, and I hugged her, my heart full. The exhibit traveled, and so did I, speaking in cities I'd never seen, painting new canvases, teaching wherever I went. The community center thrived, Mia taking the lead, Sophie still drawing stars. I saw the ocean again, walked the shore, felt Tom in the salt air. I painted him there, a shadow in the waves, not gone, but part of me. I didn't need the house, the trust, the past. I had this life, and it was mine. One spring, I went back to the community center and added to the rosebush a trellis, small but sturdy, to help it climb. Sophie helped, her hands messy with dirt, her laugh bright. "It's going to grow forever," she said, and I nodded because it would, and so would I. I stood back, the mural behind me, the rosebush before me, and felt peace, not the kind that comes from others, but the kind you build yourself. I went home, opened my notebook, and wrote, "Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself." I closed it, picked up a canvas, and painted a sky endless and open, with a single star shining for me. I hung it by the rose painting, lit a candle, and smiled. I was Margaret, and I was whole.